what we try to do and what we try to urge other news outlets to do is, if you'll do the news and you'll report who, what, when, where, why, we'll talk to political pundits and scientists and former candidates, and we'll talk about what it means, and we'll try to divide those two. And so that's why today's event is about the politics of deficit and debt reduction and the deficit debt crisis. Why aren't people talking about it? You know, that we don't cover the breaking news from the Fed about what the latest number is. We talk about, hey, I've been to, you know, well, anyway, I just want to let you kind of know a little bit, and that's something to bring to the conversation. So, what is it, 202? Well, why don't we go ahead and get started?
Reduction
And,
and
let
the
me know,
deficit crisis.
are we on the stream?
Very good.
So welcome everyone, my name is Michael Graham, I'm the managing editor of New Hampshire Journal, NHJournal.com, and we are delighted to host this event about debt deficits and the first in the nation primary. I have attended probably 30 events for the various candidates, everyone from Asa Hutchinson and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to President Trump, and it is fascinating how rarely the topic of America's $34 trillion debt and the growing deficits gets mentioned. It's amazing. There's far more time spent on what's my favorite sandwich than there is, hey, what are our kids gonna do when they have to pay this bill? And so when we had the opportunity to present this roundtable, we jumped at the chance. And Joe Penland, Joe from Texas, thank you very much for making this possible. We really appreciate it. And because you made it possible, you have to go last. Sorry.
That's good.
Because the way I want to start the conversation is to start where the trouble is, which is in Washington, D.C., former U.S. Comptroller General David Walker. And then the impact of that trouble from someone who was in Washington and is now in Concord balancing our budget here in New Hampshire, State Senate President Jeb Bradley. And then we'll go to the voice of the people. And the real question is this: what would you have to do to get young people like you, to get an average working guy at a shop, to get a couple in the suburbs to care about this debt and deficit? Are politicians not talking about it because it doesn't work, or are they talking about it because they don't have an answer or something in between? And so that's how we want to frame the conversation. We'll start with some comments from our three panelists, and then we'll be taking questions from the floor as well as from some of the folks who are watching on streaming right now. They'll be texting me some questions in for our guests as well. So, Comptroller General, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for coming. I'm glad to see we've got a lot of young people here who are going to get the bill for this. I hate to tell you that. But first, let me tell you what Comptroller General is. In English, it's the Auditor General of the United States, the Chief Accountability Officer of the United States, and it's the Chief Executive Officer of something called the Government Accountability Office, the GAO. So, you know, I'm kind of like the umpire. You call the balls and strikes, equal opportunity, complimenter and critiquer, and let me say at the outset that both political parties are responsible for where we are. And let me also say at the outset that, as I said in 2007, the greatest threat to America's future is our fiscal irresponsibility. And in 2010, then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, said not only is it the greatest threat to our future, it is the greatest national security threat facing the United States. And it's gotten a lot worse since then. The truth is the USS America is taking on water, and our superpower status is at risk. We are a declining power, but we can turn it around, and it's critically important that we do that. 4 factors are necessary to be a superpower in today's world: global economic power, global diplomatic influence, global military capabilities, and global cultural influence. We have that today. But the leading indicator on the way up and the way down is economic power. And if you can't put your finances in order, you will not maintain economic power over time. And we need to put our finances in order. Let me give you a few statistics. In the year 2000, the beginning of this millennium, we had a budget surplus of $236 billion. And we actually paid down debt in that year. And Chairman Greenspan of the Federal Reserve was worried because he thought we might pay off all the national debt. He testified right before me. I testified as Comptroller General. I wasn't worried a nanosecond about that because I know how the place works. There was no chance that was going to happen. So from 236 billion surplus to a 1.7 to 1.8 trillion deficit this last year, from 54% debt to GDP to 120, from 20.4 trillion in total liabilities and unfunded promises to 125 trillion just since 2000. The biggest factors that you need to focus on is how much debt do we have as a percentage of the economy, how much is interest as a percentage of the budget, and how much is mandatory spending as a percent of overall. Those are the three key graphics. Well, you've got a few charts here, which I'll commend to you. The first one talks about debt to GDP. And you can see that for a vast majority of our country's history, we never went over 40% until World War II. But then we reclaimed fiscal responsibility, we grew the economy, and we came back down below 40% of debt to GDP. But we lost our way. We reclaimed fiscal responsibility in the late 90s and early 2000s, but things have been totally out of control since 2003. So the problem is not where we were, it's not even necessarily where we are, it's where we're headed. And as you can see in this graphic, we're headed to third world nation status from a financial standpoint if we don't change course. The next one, you can see the projected spending going forward between now and 30 years from now. And these are official government statistics from the Congressional Budget Office, which is nonpartisan in the legislative branch. And what's the fastest growing expense? Interest. And what do you get for interest? As we say in the South, shinola, nothing, all right? So that's our fastest growing expense. And you know, we're just on an imprudent and unsustainable path. Let me say this, I take some hope, because the people are way ahead of the politicians. In 2012, I did a 10,000-mile, 27-state national fiscal responsibility bus tour that started in Manchester in St. Anselm's. And by the way, Bernie Sanders crossed the state line and he tried to undercut the whole event, but he failed. He failed, thank God. But I started in St. Anselm's, went through 27 states, 10,000 mile, had special events with representative groups of voters, and here's the bottom line. Well over 90% said this should be a top priority for the President of the United States and the Congress. Well over 90% said that we ought to focus on getting debt to GDP down to a reasonable, sustainable level. Well over 90% said everything's got to be on the table, not everything's equal. Mandatory spending, discretionary spending, revenues, but not everything's equal. Well over 90% agreed on 6 principles and values that would bring people together rather than divide them apart, which we can get into the Q&A. And 77 to 97% agreed on specific budget controls, Social Security reforms, healthcare reforms, defense, government organization operation, tax reforms, and political reforms. 77 to 97%. That overrides a veto, even if you get a veto. So the people are way ahead of the politicians. But the politicians don't think that the people can handle the truth. And they're not willing to accept tough choices. That's wrong, because the future of this country and your futures are at stake here. And I'm fighting here, and so's Joe and a few others, to be able to say, look, why do we do this? Because I love my country, because I love my kids, and I love my grandkids. I'm not worried about me. I'm not worried about Joe. I'm not really worried about my kids. My son works for Google, among other things. He's going to be okay. But I'm really worried about my grandkids. I'm very, very concerned. And yet, in many cases, they don't even have a vote. They don't even have a vote. So let me say this. 3 things are necessary in order to be able to restore fiscal sanity and sustainability. We have to have a statutory fiscal commission that will engage the American people with the facts, the truth, the tough choices, that will solicit input, make a package of recommendations with a guaranteed up or down vote. The good news is there's bipartisan legislation in the House and the Senate. The Speaker is for this. I'm hoping it might get tacked on to a new CR or to an appropriations bill. We must have that. Secondly, we've got to have a constitutional amendment that limits how much debt as a percentage of the economy we take on. We can't continue to write blank checks and run up the credit card. The people understand that, and unfortunately Washington doesn't. And thirdly, we've got to have a Grace Commission on steroids, which we can get in the Q&A if you don't know what that is, most of you are too young for that, on steroids, that will basically relook at the base of government. What should government do? Who should do it? How should it be done? And how do we measure success? The federal government is a bloated bureaucracy. It gets the money, spends the money, but doesn't generate the kind of results that we need. You know, let me say this. Any presidential candidate who does not expressly agree that they support the need for a statutory fiscal sustainability commission and a constitutional amendment that would limit debt to GDP is part of the problem, not part of the solution. This is mandatory, not optional, mandatory. In addition to that, any presidential candidate who says, I'm not going to touch Social Security, or I'm not going to touch Medicare, basically what they're saying is, I'm for cutting Social Security benefits 20% across the board in 10 years, and I'm for cutting Medicare benefits 11% across the board in less than 10 years, because that's what happens if you do nothing. We're in a situation where doing nothing overall, and with regard to those programs, is not an option. So it's time to recognize reality. We've got to make tough choices if we want our future to be better than our past. And let me just give you a few lessons from history. Rome. Rome was the longest standing empire in the history of mankind. About 500 years as a republic, about 500 years as an autocracy. But Rome fell for several reasons. Number one, fiscal irresponsibility. Number two, political instability. Number three, moral decline. Number four, overextended military. And number five, inability to control its borders. Do those sound familiar? And Washington, when he left office, voluntarily after serving 2 terms, gave us 4 warnings. Avoid excessive debt, avoid foreign wars, avoid regionalism, and avoid factionalism, which he meant political parties. How are we doing on that? We need to learn from history, we need to learn from others, and from others it's Switzerland. Switzerland about 20 years ago adopted a constitutional amendment along the lines of what I'm talking about, with great positive impact and with over 80% support from the citizens of that great nation. So, in summary, we're a great country, but we have serious problems. We need to recognize reality, face the facts, take steps to create a better future for all of our sake, and I'm happy to answer your questions when we get to that.
So, Senate President Bradley, I know you've got comments you want to make, but I want you to address one thing that the comptroller mentioned, which is the people are ready to have the debt deficit addressed, because you were in Congress making tough choices about spending. I'm just wondering how the people responded when they heard that there might be a little less spending. So that's just something to include as you present your remarks, and thanks so much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Michael. Pleasure to be here. Thank you, everybody, for attending. So I served in Congress from 2003 to 2006, and when I left Congress, while it was still too high, the budget deficit that we were running was about $150 billion a year, and that was in the middle of the Iraq War. So it is possible, to ensure that spending restraint happens. At that time, we were in the middle of a big debate about the capital gains tax and President Bush's call for reduction on the tax of interest and dividends. And so a lot of people on a partisan basis would say, oh, the reason that the deficit and the debt are going up is because of the tax relief. Well, guess what? It wasn't the case. When we cut the capital gains tax, revenue went up because we unleashed the power of the economy. Same thing that happened in 2017 and 18 during the Trump years. Tax cuts spurred innovation, incentives, repatriation of money, revenues went up. We have proven that in New Hampshire also, where we have to balance our budget. We don't have the ability to put anything on the credit card. It's revenues have to meet expenditures. And we've done that, and we've done that successfully. But we also lowered tax rates, and we generated huge surpluses because there was more economic activity. So while it's easy for some to blame the tax cuts it's not 100% accurate at all. I think the comptroller did a pretty good job of outlining the problem. It's 3 entitlement programs: Medicare, which is health care for people like me that are older than 65. It is a government-run healthcare system that you get about 75% of the cost covered. Most people like myself have major medical policies over and above Medicare, but the costs are staggering. Social Security, same thing, although with a slightly different age requirement. I wasn't eligible for Social Security until I reached, I think it was 67. And then there's Medicaid, which is the federal-state partnership between the feds and state governments that pays healthcare costs for very low-income people. And then obviously the interest on the national debt, which, as we've seen what's happened with inflation, we are spending about $1 trillion a year on interest on the national debt. So just to put this in, there are about 25 of you that are here. You may not be taxpayers yet, federal taxpayers. So your debt that you inherit with the $34 trillion of debt is about $100,000 per person. Just think about that. That's per person. But if you're a federal taxpayer, it's about $260,000 per person. So the solution is not going to be easy. Nobody was hit harder than me, over the debate about privatizing Social Security. Not that that was the answer, but it was a reform. At least somebody was trying to debate a reform, and I got eviscerated. I got eviscerated by President Bush, and I got eviscerated by Democrats because I was taking a cautious approach. But things like raising the retirement age, means testing, Medicare, work requirements under Medicaid, there are a range of things that we can do to rein in those 3 government programs. But just look at the Republican presidential primary, where the only candidate who's talking about raising the retirement age is being panned by former President Trump and Governor DeSantis. So there you have it. It is toxic. I served with Paul Ryan. He was the budget guru, later became Speaker of the U.S. House. I'm sure a lot of us in this room remember the ads of Granny going off the cliff, okay, in a wheelchair. So anybody who touches that third rail of politics, it is problematic. So what's it going to take? Who knows what it's going to take, but it is going to take a lot of compromise to get it. It can't all be changes to these entitlement programs. There are probably going to have to be some tax changes. On my side of the aisle, that's always difficult because we have proven that tax incentives work in terms of growing the economy. We've shown that in Washington, shown it in New Hampshire. When you grow the economy and revenue grows, everybody benefits. But in a deeply divided country as we are now, there's going to have to be some give and take. And while before my time, Tip O'Neill and President Reagan, apparently over a lot of Kentucky bourbon, cut the last Social Security deal, and it lasted for quite some time. So there are things that we can do. They're actually not that hard. I mean, for those of you who are in your 20s and 30s, raising the retirement age slightly every year is not the biggest deal in the world, but the long-term actuarial impact of that is very important. It has to happen. And it'll either happen because we come together as a nation, or it'll happen to us when we can no longer borrow the kind of money that we have to do, and then we print the money, and then the inflation. If you think inflation under Joe Biden is bad, wait until we start printing that kind of money. So I'll stop there and happy to answer questions. Michael,
and we will
thank
take
you
questions
again.
in a minute, but I have to ask you, Joe Penland, Joe from Texas, why are you doing this? I mean, you're a business guy, you could be in Texas. whatever, yachts, polo ponies, whatever it is you people do down there, drilling, oil. I understand that Granny Clampett is somewhere down, no, but in all seriousness, I mean, you have other options. What is your goal in this project that you're under?
That's the fifth time I've been asked the same question today. But it is the question. And I look at these college students, and I'm so glad they're here today. And we've touched on Social Security. We've touched on all the problems that this country has. We make a lot of money. And we've touched on that too. When revenue's up, we're making a lot of money. But if you make a lot of money, and you don't hold on to any of it, or you spend more than you make, you're like your federal government. They make a lot of money, and they spend that plus. So that's not just the answer, making the money. Making the money and managing it correctly is the answer. And we make trillions of dollars a year. Trillions of dollars. And we have for many, many, many years. We are a global superpower. We got that big status, that big bump right after World War II. We came out of World War II so decisive on the world stage because we didn't lose railroads and refineries and plants like Europe did and Japan did. We had some damage at Pearl Harbor, unfortunately, and it was grave. But as far as a nation, we came out of it pretty unscathed. We were better off than any other country. And we took up from making tanks and ships to making combines and tractors and equipment. And we were so far ahead of the rest of the world. And when you look at those countries that we helped destroy, as far as Japan, and you look at what happened with all of Germany, okay, you look at all that. Those people dug themselves out from under that rubble after the atomic bomb, built their country back. Japan's the #1 lender to America today. Now, as Americans 73 years old, I can tell you, talking to younger people, I think that's an embarrassment. How can you be the superpower in 1945 and go from there to borrowing money from the country that you bombed with an atomic bomb? It's mismanagement on a gross scale. And they're doing it at warp speed today. Why am I doing it? Like my friend Dave Walker says, for my grandkids, my great-grandkids. But when I left the house today, my wife had wrote me a note. And we prayed about this last night. And we do because we are able to help a lot of people in our area. I can't help millions of people in my area. I can't help hundreds of millions of people like this country has. But if we can wake you up, and a lot of other people in this country say enough's enough, we don't have to have it like it is. Don't accept it's going to be like this forever. It doesn't have to be. You're smart people. You don't have to just take what's handed to you. You contest it every day, and you should. Hold up for your rights. Make sure that your congressmen, your senators, and all of your elected officials do what they say they're going to do. So I took this up, and when I got up this morning, I looked at it, and Linda had me a note. And she said, I prayed again for you last night to give you wisdom when you speak to these people today. She says, please have a good day and be safe, and I'll see you tomorrow. We have 8 grandkids. We have 8 great-grandkids. We have 5 children. I was raised on, Jed touched on a while ago, on Social Security. 1957, my daddy had a massive stroke. The day before, he was drinking what he drank every day. He was an alcoholic. So we had nothing in the cupboard for us except his whiskey to eat. We were poor, instantly. Couldn't eat in 2 weeks. We drew $200 a month Social Security. My mama took in laundry to feed us. If it wasn't for that Social Security, we'd have starved to death. It is important. And people, when I went to Dallas and talked to the Young Republicans Convention a few months ago about Social Security, and they said, well, Mr. Pillman, how does it help me? I'm not going to draw Social Security. It's going to run out. It's not going to run out. It's a pay-as-we-go. We're running out of our surplus. So when Social Security runs out of the surplus, instead of your parents or your grandparents getting 100% of what they're getting today, they'll get 72 to 75%. And that will double the poverty rate in elderly people overnight. And that's a disgrace for America, a country this strong, to let that happen. Social Security is not an entitlement. Your parents and your grandparents and you that are working today, you're already paying in your own Social Security. You're entitled to get that back, like the deal we made when we took it out of your check and we took it out of the employer. But when we've got people up there fiddling with it and doing other things with it, send it God knows wherever, all over the world, and we got people here that's in trouble, then we need to wake up Washington. And I'm not a politician, nothing against that, Jed. I'm not as educated as my friend over here. I'm not a celebrity like Sean Hannity. I got no axe to grind. They can't come at me and say, we're not going to vote for him. I'm not asking nobody for money. I'm just asking people to pay attention. So I wrote Linda a note on the way out. You have a good day. She's a barrel racer, been riding barrel horses for 70 years. She's hit her knee a few times on the barrel. She's suffering with some problems right now. She has to go get treatments every day. I said, I hope your knee and your leg feels better. And I appreciate what you're saying. And I am going to be careful on what I do. And I said, you stay close to our children and our grandchildren. But there's a lot of millions of people out here that don't have somebody that can take care of them. And that's why I'm doing what I do. I'm doing it for everybody in this country. But make no mistake, if America fails financially, if America fails, then the rest of the world is going to be in trouble too, because the rest of the world looks to us. And I was asked by Politico the other day, 4 people on the screen asking me questions. What do you think about this and what do you think about that? I said, if I was a candidate, I'd answer you in 30 seconds, but I'm not a candidate. If you'll ask me questions about money, I'll talk about that, because most of my life I didn't have any. But what I was able to make and save and invest and help people that don't have what we have every day, that's the American way. Is look when you walk out in this hallway at all the inventions. And those people made all this stuff and made it by hand and made it work and made this the most powerful country in the world. And they didn't have a cell phone, and they didn't have a computer, and they didn't have all the things that we have today, but they had, up here, they wanted a job, they wanted to take something home to their family, they wanted their country to be stronger. And you know, we got a problem down on the border right now. Okay, that can be addressed. We just got to quit kicking the can down the road. But look in your history book at Ellis Island. It started in 1894. It stopped in 1954. We brought 20 million people into this country that had the American dream that you're born with. You're born with what those people left their homeland to come here to get. There's a chance to be an American. And if you look at it today, 38% of the 340 million Americans have ties to Ellis Island. So it's not a bad thing to bring people here that want to work. It's a bad thing to bring people here that are selling drugs and taking advantage of people and abusing people and overrunning it. If you monitor it right, that would be a great thing. And if we're ever going to balance this budget, we need more people to go to work and less government spending. It's a balancing act. But let me tell you right now, in this country, there's 10 million jobs with help wanted signs out today that we can't fill. So some of them $80,000, $90,000 jobs. We can't fill them for various reasons. There's people that they're not able to work. There's people that have decided they'll take what the government sends them. And there's people taking care of elderly people or people that got sick on COVID. There's a lot of reasons. But we've got about 100 million people in this country of the average working age of 16 to 64 that are not working. So either get off your rear and go to work and help your country, or let me close that border with the right politicians and bring me somebody in here that's got work on their mind. When you walk down that hall and you look at that, those are not born American people. A lot of them, you look at them, they're Irish and Italian and German. Check your descent, check your family tree and see where you came from, okay? Very few people are true Americans. Very few. And both sides of me have touched on this being the greatest country in the world. It is by far the greatest country in the world. But nobody in Washington today takes any credit for that. They inherited the greatest country in the world. It's just too far in debt. We've got to stop that. Look at this slide, if you will, that shows $39.9 trillion. That, sorry? 33.9. That's of December the 7th of 23. Now, why did I put December the 7th? That was when Pearl Harbor that was Pearl Harbor Day, December the 7th, 1941. 33.9. Now look at where the economies of China, Japan, Germany, India, and United Kingdom combined is 33.9. Our debt ties what their economies are. That's embarrassing again. And if you look at this, there's some people on this chart that's not really friendly to us. China's not your buddy. Don't think that for 1 minute that China's your good buddy, because they're not. They're powering up with some people that are other countries that don't have our best interests at heart. Look at your last page here, and that goes back to Social Security. You got 3 lines on that page. First line says that the blue line at the top, in 1983, that's how far we should have went before it ran out, in 65, which was 75 years. Then you look down here, in 88, we'd done spent too much money. It's gonna run out in 48. And now you look down here in 23, it runs out in 34, 35. Push has come to shove for America. We've got to pay our bills. It doesn't make any difference how much money you make. If you overspend, then you're gonna stay in trouble, and you're gonna stay in debt. And thank y'all for coming out.
So we're going to take some questions from you in just a second, but I want to ask a question for Mr. Walker and State Senate President Bradley, which is, what about the argument that we don't have a debt or deficit problem, we have a growth problem, and that simply having economic growth can do it? And one example you might point to, Senator Bradley, is New Hampshire, where you've been rolling back the business taxes, you've been rolling back the meals, hotel and meals taxes, and yet you've had record revenue some years, strong surpluses. Is that enough, or is it the case that, as Joe just said, it doesn't matter how much money you make, if you just keep spending more, you'll never catch up? And why don't we start with you, David?
Well, I'm, among other things, a certified public accountant, so I know something about math, okay? Unfortunately, America's not top 25 in the world in math, and Washington's not top 100 in the world in math, okay? You know, the bottom line is we are now taking on debt much faster than the economy is growing, and it's already too high. Anybody who tells you that we can grow our way out of this problem at the federal level would flunk math. It doesn't come close to working. As the senator said, which I agree, there are exceptions in states. There are some ones that are prudent and financially responsible, and there are others that are basket cases. The U.S. is in the latter category. And so everything's going to have to be on the table, but not everything is equal. Social insurance programs are going to have to be on the table. By the way, they're not entitlements, because you didn't pay for all of them. You paid for part of it, but not all of it, okay? But they are mandatory spending. We have written a blank check. Secondly, all discretionary spending's got to be on the table. Reprioritize and reduce projected spending. I'm on the Defense Business Board. There's a lot of waste in the Defense Department. There's a lot of waste in the Defense Department. And in addition to that, we're going to have more revenues. We need comprehensive tax reform that makes the system simpler, fair, generates more revenues, okay, in an equitable fashion. And by the way, of the budget, over 70% of the budget each year is mandatory spending. We've written a blank check. Over 70%. And then when you consider tax expenditures, tax preferences, deductions, exemptions, credits, and exclusions, 1.5 to 1.7 trillion. That means that the real budget of the United States, we control less than 15% of the spending. What the heck kind of budget is that?
Senator Bradley, can you grow your way out?
Well, yeah, you have to have growth.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
we're not going to solve this problem without growth. Now, the difference between Washington and New Hampshire is we have spending restraint and growth.
Right.
And that's why we generate surpluses. I make it sound simple. It's not that simple, but that is the principle. That's why, you know, for the last, well, as long as I can remember, we have been able to balance our budget. Some years it's tougher than others. In the recession in 2010, it was really difficult. We had to make some very difficult spending reductions. We did it. And then we put New Hampshire on a firm path, and we were able to lower business taxes through the economic activity that created, that brought in surpluses, okay? So the federal government does not engage in spending restraint. And as you know, Mr. Walker said, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, and now interest on the national debt are on a glide path toward chaos. And the Congress doesn't, because they are mandatory spending, not discretionary spending, they're not even reviewed. And the wherewithal to do the kind of reforms, whether it's Medicaid or Medicare or Social Security, has never been there. There are some things that, as I said before, that we could do. Means testing Medicare is one of them. Work requirements under Medicaid, raising the retirement age for Social Security. Those are all things that we could do. In order to get the wherewithal, though, we're probably going to have to, as David said, have some tax initiatives too, and that becomes problematic for people on my side of the aisle, just as on the other side of the aisle. Anything that talks about reforming Social Security or Medicare is granny going off the cliff. So you have a 2-year election cycle, and every 2 years you fight over the gavel, and you're seeing it happen now. Again, as I said before, you've got Governor DeSantis panning, raising the retirement age, former President Trump, same thing. We're not going to solve the debt and deficit problem without entitlement reform.
David Walker, you had something you wanted to add,
Yeah.
and then we'll go to questions.
The 6 principles, I told you there were 6 principles and values that got over 90% agreement among voters around the country. Number 1 was pro-growth. You want pro-growth policies because if you can grow the denominator on debt to GDP faster than the numerator, you're making progress even if the numerator's going up, all right? The other thing I just want to acknowledge is that Senator Manchin just joined us to be involved in this.
Yeah.
And Senator
I know him well
Manchin.
enough that I could do that.
No, and Senator Manchin and Senator Romney have sponsored legislation to create the commission that I talked about. It is absolutely essential. If you don't have that in a fiscal responsibility constitutional amendment, we're not going to solve this problem. So thank you, Senator.
We'll get a microphone on Senator. So we had questions. I wanted to bring in a ringer to ask a tough question for our 3 panelists. So I don't know if Joe and David and Senator Bradley are ready for this, but Senator Manchin, you have a question for these 3.
Well,
You can leave that right there.
I'm just going to add one thing to it because I've been able to see it up close and personal for about 14 years. But I've watched us accumulate debt at a more rapid rate than ever in the history of our country. And I'm sure that no one knows this better than my friend David here. And there's no checks and balances. And everything they're talking about, we've been talking about. I'm going to give you a few sobering moments. In 2011, my first meeting armed services, I was a governor before. I've been involved in quite a bit had a hard time keeping a job, so I was Secretary of State. I was governor, then I'm a U.S. Senator. So I go to the Senate. I'm studying now because coming from a governor, I have a National Guard, but I wasn't looking at the world picture of where our threats for the United States of America. So I'll never forget the first armed services meeting I had gone to was Admiral Mike Mullins. He was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and all of the major military heads. And we were going to ask the question, and basically what's the greatest threat the United States faces? Mike Mullin, chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, who has his finger on everything going on in the world and every hot spot that we have and every challenge that could be really harmful to our country, didn't take a second, never hesitated. He said the debt of the nation will take us down before any military power will ingress on us. The debt of our nation will take us down first. We were $13 trillion of debt at that time. Let me show you how it's been accumulated. And David has opened my eyes. The thing that we do when we pass a piece of legislation, you know, they always talk about we have to pay for us. Let's pay for this. We don't settle next generation. Let's pay for it. Makes it sound good, right? We're going to pay for it. CBO's, at the best, it's a guesstimate, correct? CBO is probably a guesstimate based on prior and based on what they think future demands will be. So they put, I'm going to say, I'll just round it off, to a $500 billion is what this piece of legislation has been calculated to cost. And then $500 billion is how they're going to pay for it. So you would think, why are we accumulating debt? That's a pay for. What happens when we pass a piece of legislation in Washington? You have a 10-year time period. That means 10 years that you're able to collect that much money to pay for it. But the spending continues on. How about if you have something that's so popular that everybody loves it, and there's twice as many people using it that you thought. You use up to $500 billion in 4 years. What happens to the next 6? They have the spending authority, so it's deficit spending. So you want to know how you're accumulating this debt so rapidly. Both sides are absolutely horrible about this and won't tell you. So I'm trying to make a movement in this whole bill. Mitt and I, we have the Financial Stability Act. But that's also going to be looking at how we reform our bills. So anytime that basically there is a CBO score, whenever the money runs out and we exceed that money, then all spending authority stops too. So wait a minute, you told me we were going to have a 10-year run on this bill. Well, guess what? It's more popular than we thought. We've got to go back to Congress to see if they'll support more. And you find ways to pay for it. You don't continue to add on the deficit spending. That's what's killing us. And not meeting, you know, when there's so many, all of our trust funds are in trouble. Every one of them. And you have everybody
Steve,
talking.
what do you mean by that for the people?
Trust
when you say
funds.
a trust fund? What do you
Highway
mean?
trust. How are you going to pay for a highway system? Everybody's going to EVs. Next of all, well, a little bit of gas money, gas taxes, we get 18 cents. They want to stop that because it's politically popular. But that's totally irresponsible. You can't do that. Yeah. And then, don't you think there should be a mileage charge for EVs that are using the same highways and bridges? Something's got to be done that makes sense. And we can't, I mean, and then I got certain administrators says, well, anybody that makes less than $400,000 not going to pay anything any different. Well, wait a minute, I can't fix the problem. Everyone's got to have to pay their fair share.
I want to bring in,
What's
just real quick.
ironic is trust funds, I used to be a trustee of Social Security and Medicare. I put them in quotes, trust funds, they're not real trust funds, they're trust the government funds. And all they really are is accounting devices. And guess what's in them? Anybody know what's in them?
IOU.
IOUs, U.S. government debt, that's what's in them, all right?
You mentioned trust, and that's why I want to get Joe from Texas in here. So because look at this table here. We've got a U.S. Senator, Senate President at the state level, former Congressman, got a member of the administration, and a business guy. You guys should be able to figure this all out. You should be able to figure out how to do the math, et cetera. And my question is, do you think that the average businesswoman or man, the average person who owns a small business in Texas or in New Hampshire, trusts the government? So that if they came to them and said, we've got a plan, we agree with you, $34 trillion, here's our 10-year plan, everyone's going to hurt a little bit, but it's going to pay off in the end. Do the people you talk to every day in business, would they trust the government if they brought them that message?
Absolutely not. I mean, why would you trust a government that 24 years in a row, they went from paying their deficit and their debt down
Right.
to go from $4 trillion when Ross Perot ran for office? He ran because $4 trillion was unsustainable. And he ran and made that a big issue for America to pay attention to. And now, so he wasn't successful as making it to be the president, which he really didn't want to be. Dave was one of his good friends. But what he wanted to do is wake America up. Okay? And so he brought that up, the debt. All right, so what do? We had Newt Gingrich and a contract with America. They came out, worked with Bill Clinton, paid it down 4 years in a row. Balanced it and paid it down. Okay, for 4 years. Then you had we had a Republican come in for 8 years. Then you had a Democrat come in for 8 years. Then you had a Republican come in for 4 years. You've got a Democrat that hopefully stays in just 4 years. So that's 24 years. 24 years. And 24 years as a loser in your accounting.
Right.
If anybody in here kept their checkbook, paid their house, paid their business, and was 24 years in the hole, the bank would have called your debt a long time ago. And think about the bank.
Right.
The banks are out there right now, and who's running the banks? The federal government. I sit on the bank board. I know who regulates us. We have all kinds of checks and balances. When they come in to audit us, they go and look at what was our last problem at the last audit. Did we solve that problem? They look at director loans. They look at hot buttons. But guess what? They can't even balance their checkbook. And they're in charge of all the billions and trillions of dollars that everybody's entrusted into the banks into this country.
Right.
So you go from insurance being $100,000 FDIC to $250,000 to banks now fail and we pay 100% of it. So we're completely off the chart. They don't want to touch a rail. They've lost the railroad.
So who has a question for us? Identify yourself and share your question.
Jim Rubens, former state senator of District 5. So I'm asking politicians, ever since Ross Perot started saying that candidates and people, office office holders would have to drink their prune juice and belly up and deal with the debt problem, right? We've heard it for all that period of time. It's only gotten worse and worse. So I'm asking Dave, Comptroller General Dave Walker, you're involved in something called the Federal Fiscal Sustainability Foundation. So I want to know what that organization is doing to deal with this problem in a way that politicians have not been able to deal with in the past, and specifically what role New Hampshire might have in that. And now that the Senator mentions here, what role West Virginia might have in that process.
Well, first, as I said, two things are essential if we're going to restore fiscal sanity and sustainability. First, the commission, the type that Senator Manchin and Senator Romney have proposed, and there's bipartisan legislation in the House as well. And secondly, we need a fiscal responsibility constitutional amendment because statutory approaches have failed. The debt ceiling is a bad joke. One Congress can't bind the next Congress. The only thing that can bind current and future Congresses is a constitutional amendment. There's two ways to get a constitutional amendment. 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate proposes something, 3/4 of the states ratify it. 27 have been done that way. That's how many we have. The founders were very smart people. They knew that Congress might become so out of touch and out of control, or that there could be certain things where there was a conflict of interest, like controlling spending, like term limits, like campaign finance, that the states should have the right to be able to hold a convention of states to propose one or more amendments. Not a constitutional convention, a convention of states to propose one or more amendments. The Federal Fiscal Sustainability Foundation, which I'm on the board, recently discovered that in 1979, 39 states had active applications for such a convention. It only takes 34. Congress didn't do anything. And by the way, West Virginia is one of the states. By the way, New Hampshire is one of the states. And so now what has to happen is the states need to assert their rights under Article 5. We've got one state out west who's willing to sue the Congress. We need a couple of more. In New Hampshire, in West Virginia would be very helpful, and New Hampshire would be very helpful. And I'm speaking to a large group tomorrow along with Joe, about 400 people. I guess it's the annual GOP.
That's right, the state convention.
And I'm going to challenge New Hampshire to get on board because we're sinking. We're sinking.
I want to
We
ask
can
if
save
the students here, do one of you have a question for the panel from one of our college students here? Yes, right there, sir.
Yeah, you mentioned like the defense fund, and if it's like a problem and they have a ton of waste, then like why doesn't anyone ever like do anything?
Reforming defense, reforming spending on defense?
Yeah.
We've been trying to audit, it's the only agency in the federal government that's not audited. We've been trying, John McCain and I, when I first got there, we've been trying ever since John and I introduced it. We got the Marines, we got them to audit, and I think we're close on the Navy. We're just having a hard time. They can keep telling us this is so gigantuan, I guess, I'm trying to think of an adjective to use.
Humongous.
But the bottom line is there has to be an accounting for every dollar we spend. Let me just say real quickly, because I think, Senator, you asked me, you said something. There's no penalty. There's no penalty. You know, by law, we're supposed to have a budget every October 1.
Right.
We hadn't had one forever. And we've been deficit spending for 21 years in a row. Because none of you all can survive by spending more than you take in. 21 months or 21 days would make it difficult for any of us. There are 21 years and no one's ever held us accountable. And that's just unconscionable. There's discretionary and non-discretionary spending. Those are two buckets you want to look at, discretionary, non-discretionary. Look how they've grown disproportionately. Non-discretionary means we don't even debate it. We don't get to argue about it and think there's waste. It's just there. It's grown more rapid than any of our spending. And why are we throwing so much in non-discretionary? You know, is it sacred cow or is it someone else's? You know, whoever's in charge can just about throw anything they want to in it and they're not contested on it. So there's so many gimmicks that have been played. So the only thing I've said, the simplest way, you've heard no budget, no pay. If we don't have a budget by October 1st, don't pay us. Nobody gets a check. They say, oh, they're all millionaires, they don't need money. I guarantee you, rich people want their money too. They'll be jumping. But if you do that, at least it holds somebody accountable at a time frame. You know, by March, we're supposed to have a agreement between the House and the Senate, and then by October 1st, we're supposed to have it worked out.
So I wanna-
Nothing ever happens.
I want to ask the four of you about an idea that Colorado has been using, which is they put in the Constitution an actual formula that says money comes in, spending is set at a percentage.
What's
So
the
we've got
balanced
a-
budget
got a
amendment?
cap.
We all have-
Well, separate from the balanced budget, it says you can spend up to the rate of inflation and growth, and that's all. And so they have a formula in place. Would the federal system allow something where you said, look, you can spend it on whatever you want, but you can only spend 2% more next year and 2% more next year? See what I'm saying? And would that work under a federal system? Let's start on the other end, and we'll come back with former Congressman and State Senate President Bradley.
I doubt that 536 members of Congress would ever, ever vote for that, right, Joe?
Oh, you're so right.
Never.
That's no hope.
And they'd never vote for not paying themselves.
I've tried it.
I'm glad you have. You know, again, this is where Washington could take a lot of common sense from New Hampshire. We get $100 a year, okay? We're there because we want to be there, okay? Nobody gets rich. People are glorified volunteers with sexy license plates. You need a lot more of that in Washington.
Pardon me if I can address the young man's
Oh, sure.
question about
The deficit, the Defense
military.
Department.
Defense Department.
Yeah. Great question. Not many people want to talk about the military on the budget side. Donald Rumsfeld made a speech the night before 9/11, and he addressed the Pentagon. And he said that America had a new adversary, and all his generals sat there and looked at him and their mouths were open and so forth. And then he said it was the Pentagon itself. He said we have $2.3 trillion that we can't account for. Their budget was $300 billion. If you do the math, they were 8 times out around, and he was trying to find out where all the waste was. So you have to have somebody. You have to have a group of people giving somebody the authority to, we need to scrub America. We need to scrub the politics of America. We need to scrub the budgets that we have and see how much waste and fraud and spending and giveaways are happening, because they're giving your money away. There's no two ways about it. We need the strongest military in the world, but if you stay 8 times out around, you're given the money, it's appropriated to you, you got $300 billion, you're $2.3 trillion in the hole, and God knows where it is today. Now what happened the next day? A plane hit the Pentagon. I've never heard it come back up, that topic. Pardon me, and I thank you for letting
No,
me address
I
that.
wanted to hear more about that. Do you have another question from, yes, ma'am?
Thank you. I'd like to thank everybody for coming in. My name is Paula Johnson. I'm from the blue city of Nashua now. Mine isn't so much a question as it is a statement here, basically. I'm 70 years old. I'm proud to be 70. I have watched Social Security and Medicare go down the drain. That's number one. We have an open board, and I hope, Senator, did you take this back to Washington, that we, the people, are fed up with all of this already. Our money's going to Ukraine. Our money is now going across the border for all these illegals to come in. We are throwing our veterans out of homes. We are throwing our elderly out of homes now. And what are we doing for the American people? We talked about Ellis Island. My parents came in to Ellis Island. We have opened the borders unbelievably. And I don't blame Governor Abbott sending the people to New York. He wanted them, he's got them. But you know what's happening now? We shut down these schools during COVID, and these kids didn't have a school, and New York is shutting down the schools now. And Washington is turning a blind eye to all of us. We the people, I have worked my whole life, I have given money to the federal government, they have stolen it from us, and we can't get it back, and look at what's happening here. Nobody cares in Washington about us. And if people in Washington don't want to have a balanced budget, represent we the people anymore, it's time to shut Washington down and send you all home and be done with it and start a whole new government. This is what I hear on the street all the time.
I electively chose to go home. I'm not running again.
And
I don't want a 6-year sentence again.
Hey, I've
But
been
that,
elected.
I went up with that. I hear this passion from taxpayers all the time.
Yeah, no,
So my
everything, this
question-
is what she's saying. The
Exactly.
things you say, first of all, the border. This is the greatest crisis we face today in America. I don't care whether you're Democrat or Republican, I've been there. and you speak to any congressperson or any senator who represents a border state, it's horrible, horrific what's happening. They call it basically, you have asylum. We've never done border asylum before. Now we're doing it. 700,000 that we don't know who they are, where they came from, until we haven't basically been able to adjudicate them. So if Congress does not do next week what it should have done a month, a year ago, or 2 years ago, if they don't do it by next week, the president has to take action. He has the authority to take action, and I'm begging the president to take that action and use the force that he has. We cannot continue this way. We just have to stop it, and then we have to start adjudicating those who are already here to find out who has the ability to stay here. So if you had 1 million people, I'll give you an example. This is the percentage. Under the liberal definition of asylum today, even under the liberal identification, which means I say you step foot on American soil and you declare that you have a threat back home and you had to come to America. That's it. That's all it takes. Only 10% qualify for that. Only 10% of 1 million people. So you have 100,000 people out of 1 million who would even qualify under the most liberal identification, or definition of asylum that could stay. We're trying to enhance, basically, it's going to be much more rigid to prove that you have a threat, that you've shown that you had bodily threat, or your family, or they've been basically targeted through gangs and things of this sort. So the parole is what they're arguing over now. It's just stupid that we're going down this and allowing the toxicity of a dysfunctional Washington. We're not going to fix, and you're upset, it's not going to be fixed in Washington. It won't. It'll be fixed here, but it won't be fixed until people speak up and start pushing harder. And it's the quality of the person you send there. That's it.
Yes, Dave.
The level of confidence in government today is at or near an all-time low, okay?
Nobody will
And that's Congress, okay? That's major institutions in government. For the first time in history, a record number of Americans believe that our future will not be as good as our past.
Correct.
All right? That is un-American. It is unacceptable. The biggest deficit this country has is not a budget deficit, it's a leadership deficit. You're going to be critically important. New Hampshire is critically important. It starts at the top. It starts with the president. Only the president is elected by all the people. And the vice president is important too, but most people vote for the president, although a vice president can help you or hurt you, depending on who it is, okay? So let's recognize that fact, all right? It starts with the first 3 words in the Constitution, which are the most important and the most powerful. We, the people, are responsible and accountable for what does or does not happen. Vote, vote, vote.
They
Okay,
can
so
shake
we,
the system up. You
we've
can
got to
shake
wrap
it.
up on time. A couple things you mentioned starts at the top and the president. President, that's an interesting job, Senator Manchin.
Let me just say this,
Any
everybody
thoughts?
thinks, I'm not here as a candidate, and I'm here basically something we call Americans Together. My daughter and I have started this. We're trying to give those who feel homeless and helpless, knowing there's support in the middle. We want to support candidates with the Democrat, Republicans, Independents who've never been affiliated before to get involved in the process. We want to change how the primaries are working, and they're not working right now. Majority primaries basically throws everybody. Everyone has a chance, even those who don't have the political wherewithals or the financial support. They still have a chance. Give you a perfect example. My friend Lisa Murkowski, Republican from Alaska, would not have been elected if it hadn't been for ranked choice, or what we call majority voting. So you have 390 out of 435 congressional districts. They're already cooked. They're cooked. Donald Duck. If you're in a blue district that's been gerrymandered to be blue, Donald Duck could win. And if you're in a red, Mickey Mouse could win. Doesn't matter. It's going to be what it is. And that's the type of representation. So it keeps us really, it's a toxic atmosphere. Until that changes, until you all get involved, I have a hard time recruiting anybody to get involved and run for politics. They won't run anymore.
I have a very simple, stupid question.
What's that?
How do you create the political will to do this?
How do you create the political will? Well, Joe from Texas, you're out trying to do that right now, right?
Well, I'm out trying to educate people because people don't really understand or get the truth about how bad things are and how things are off the rudder, like Senator Manchin says. I mean, we got a ship out here that they call Democrat. And it's most of the time it's out there and we don't have a skipper And we don't have any power, and we don't have a rudder in the water. And then you have one called Republican, does the same thing. They bump into the dock and you're 1.3 trillion down, or you bump in there, it's 1.8. We argue too much. See, what we used to do is work with the left side and the right side. They worked with one another. Right now, it doesn't matter what an administration puts in. When that administration gets out of office, whoever takes over is going to destroy a lot of the programs that was good for these Americans, just because they didn't bring it up. Leave it alone if it's good for America. That's what you have to do, and add to it.
Well, we actually have to wrap up on time, so, oh, I'm sorry, what?
I got a question.
Oh, yeah, well, okay, right here.
First, I want to have a show of hands of how many state representatives we have.
There's a couple.
Okay. How many do we have in this state?
400.
Come on.
You have 400 and you have 24 senators.
We can't even get 200. We can't even get 100 of our own representatives here. How many knew about this, Senator Bradley? How many knew about this event?
Actually, I think quite a few, because Michael does a really good job in the NHJournal. So,
There's no political will.
Well, so, listen, we really do have, yes, sir.
I have one.
Let's stick with it. No, I want to know. I want to know.
Well,
How many people?
I told you, I think quite a few people knew.
Okay.
And I suspect that,
What are we
I
gonna do about
suspect
getting
that there's a
them to
lot of
show up?
live
Well, we're-
streaming.
one step
Point
at-
at these young people.
Right.
These young people don't have any control.
We're hoping they save us.
Exactly. Let's do one more, and then we've got to wrap up with
This
the time.
actually kind of contradicts that too, but it ties together what you said and what Joe Manchin said. You said trust at the
Right.
earlier. And when I didn't realize that the senator was gonna stalk me here when I was at his other event. I was gonna tell you about his position on
I
this.
knew you were coming.
Which they know about. But the trust is really important, and I've worked on this issue, and there really are two components. One is people don't, and I think this lady kind of projected this, don't feel heard, and they don't feel like government's competent to execute it. This guy is really competent to execute stuff. That's better than anybody, and I've worked for 3 congressmen, 3 governors, and he can get it done. But he's also doing something else you didn't mention. I don't know if you mentioned actually the Heather's thing with
Yeah.
America Together. I think what they're doing there and the listening that they're doing there is the other piece. If we would just listen and have people, I think you'd have a lot more people who would get things done if they listened first.
Right.
And I think that's what we've been avoiding or missing, and I think that's what you're tackling, that.
Well,
it's
right
gonna
now,
have
the
biggest
reason I'm
impact.
here is basically you have 349,000 independents. And out of the 349,000, historically, you only have about 200,000 that actually vote in the primary. So you have 100,000+ usually stay on the sidelines until the general. This is one time you can shake up the whole world. You can shake it up. This is the bedrock of democracy as far as I'm concerned. It's always been a bellwether state. I've watched it all my life. Gave me a pretty good idea of where things were going in the country because no one could basically control you. Up here, 400 in the House, 24 in the Senate.
That's right.
It's kind of wide open. It's all about people serving and service for people. And so it's been unusual. John Lynch was the first time I was explained to me we were governors together. He said, Joe, you're not going to believe our democracy. I said, tell me about it, John. He says, well, I'm governor. I run every 2 years. Well, most governors are 4 years, okay? He says, we got 400, and we have a state smaller than yours. You have what, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 3?
Yeah.
Okay, we're 1, 7, 1, 8. So about 500,000 difference in population. And I thought, you know, ours was kind of loosey-goosey, but whew. I said, how in the heck do you manage the 400? How do you, I thought, it's really unusual, but I thought about it and says, that is purely democracy. So you all can change it. You can shake it up. You could throw them a curve they've never seen coming, and you might have some people going off of the Richter scale if things would go a different direction.
Well, I'm so glad you did that to wrap us up, because I was looking for some good news for the.
Well, this is you're right in
The good
it.
news is you can change it, you can have an impact, New Hampshire has an impact. New Hampshire Journal, the reason we host this is because we know the state can have an impact. And I just want to say a big thank you to State Senate President Jeb Bradley, Joe from Texas, David Walker, former Comptroller General, U.S. Senator Joe Manchin. Thank you so much for this conversation.